Hey guys, enter the stars. And today, basically, I just wanted to come on here and share some thoughts about the truth about the universe that we live in. Now, I don't have any show notes today or anything like that. I'm just going to speak off of the cuff and try to share with you guys what I believe is the history of the world. Now, the amazing thing about this is that we're dealing with the rest of the story, so to speak. There was once a radio show host who talked about the rest of the story. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. These are going to be things that you're not necessarily hearing or seeing in the record. Now, to get started, we have to go all the way back to the garden. Now, I'm not screen sharing on purpose because I really don't have any screenshots to show you guys today. But what I want to show you and talk to you about is going all the way back to the garden. Now, all the things that I'm going to share with you today, basically, it's okay to have an opinion on these things. A lot of times, people get so basically opinionated about certain things. They'll get upset about different doctrines and all of these things that don't necessarily matter with regard to the bigger picture. But let's do a sound check first. Make sure you guys can hear me. Go ahead and just give me a shout out. I see some people in the chat. Are you guys getting sound before we continue on? It says we're live. I see John. I see Carlos. Good. Okay. Replied to says good. You guys have sound. Great. Okay, so we're going to go all the way back to the garden. Now, there was an original plan. The original plan was for us to live in a garden. Adam and Eve live in a garden, very close to God with direct access to God, right? And then there was like this hierarchy where there was God and then the angels and man. We were all supposed to live in harmony and we were all supposed to live forever, right? This was God's plan. Now, the reason why God created man is because he saw that it was good. And that's why he created the garden as well. Beyond that, we really can't speculate as to what God had in mind, what was his general purpose in putting together the garden and man. Maybe he wanted to interact with us. Maybe he wanted to create almost like the animals, like dogs and things are like our pets or they're things that we love and it teaches us something about ourselves. Maybe that's exactly what God was kind of thinking of. And of course, a much more passionate type of interchange because God, we know that God loves us, but some of you can relate to how much you love your pet. So God basically laid all this out, laid out this beautiful garden, gave us a gift, gave us dominion over the animals. And then somehow we know the rest of the story that the devil basically came into the picture and decided he could do things better than God. Now, I get pushback on this next point I'm going to bring up. And I don't believe that the devil actually has power in any way, shape, or form over God. But I do believe he was part of the creative process and was given some kind of responsibility in how things were put together before he fell, before he became evil. And this makes sense because God has a lot of the angels doing things for him that basically handle all of the different celestial bodies and all of these things. This is talked about in the Bible that the angels basically helped with all of these things. It's also talked about in the book of Enoch. But somehow God basically had to allow the devil to do this because obviously God knows the beginning from the end. He could have put a stop to all this, but somehow he had to allow all this to play out. God being a God of love, perfect love, means that he has to let us make errors because if he were just to not let us make errors, we would all be robots, right? We would be all controlled by God, but he doesn't control us. He gives us free will and free choice. So this happens, and this is where things get interesting because we fell out of the grace of God. Basically, because we were lowered into a different type of makeup. Our former glory of the people of mankind that we had now fallen. Our flesh was altered, it was changed. And there's proof of this because Eve went from having no birth pain to having birth pain. That signifies or alludes to some kind of metabolic change, as well as Adam. Adam began to sweat. We know in the Bible that it says that he would till the fields by the sweat of his brow. So obviously there was some kind of metabolic change in humanity. Now, I don't know to what degree that change took place, but I can tell you that other humans after Adam and Eve, some of them had special qualities. For instance, Noah, when he was born, he actually spoke and he could walk. This is in the book of Enoch. And other people throughout time had countenances and basically an aura about them. All this is in the Bible. So you can imagine that Adam and Eve, the original couple, had some kind of defining features or defining makeup that basically caused them to be a little bit different than everybody than they were after the fall of man. Hopefully that makes sense. But basically they had some kind of glory attached to them that they had now lost. And I believe that they became more beast-like. The same way the devil became the lowest of the beasts of the field, which is what Genesis said. I believe we also became beast-like. And so we're in these beast bodies. Now, someone asked me today, they said, you spend a lot of time decoding and showing all the evil and stuff. Well, what has God done for us lately? God, he already did it. He gave us his son. He gave us his son who conquered death at that event. He conquered it. All we have to do is believe and walk the walk. Everything else is an illusion. Everything else is the devil trying to steal your salvation. Everything else is putting doubt in your mind, making you not believe. But if you believe, as he asks us to do, you've already received the gift. What is that? It's everlasting life. It's after this place, you get to actually enjoy your life. But what we're doing here is loving one another so we can all get through this together. That's why loving one another as yourself is one of the top commandments. Because in doing that, you become, you have, you're now helping other human beings to also see the light and love of God, you see? Because we're all reflecting God's love through our actions and through who we are. Every time you do something good, or you're a good person, or you help another person, you're giving other people hope so they can live out their lives and then have everlasting life on the other side. I used to have this basically a rule to live by, and that is I want if the rest of the world was like me, then I figure that I'm doing good. I'm doing okay. Like, I try to imagine a world with everyone like myself. And if I don't like that world and what it's going to look like, then I need to change. I need to be better. And that's a general rule for everybody. Looking at your own life and how you treat people, is that the world you want to live in based on your own life? And if the answer is yes, I think this world would be a better place if everybody was like me, then that would be great. But if the answer is no, then you've got work to do because you're not loving others as yourself, which is what the Bible commands. So now we're going to get into the time prison. What is the time prison? Well, it's interesting because CERN is basically smashing particles of matter at the speed of light. And when that they're doing that in these experiments, the particles begin to act differently. They begin to act interdimensionally. They take on mass that wasn't there before. They become heavy. And we're not talking about simply centrifugal force going around the collider. They've measured the atomic mass of these particles and they have actually increased, almost as if they could create different elements by changing the atomic mass. Now, why does this matter? Well, there's something about the light and approaching high speeds. and how that slows down time. They've done these experiments, and I've talked about this in previous videos, where basically they took an atomic clock, they put it on a high-speed jet, and they put a bunch of people and scientists in this jet. They flew around the Earth, or through around the circle of the Earth, depending on what you believe in. And they came back. The people on the ground had an atomic clock too. And when they compared the two times, the atomic clock on the airplane had slowed down. Now, that was just simply flying at supersonic speeds. If you were able to fly at the speed of light, in other words, if you were able to put a vehicle inside of the Hadron Collider and put people in it and send it around at the speed of light, when those people got off, only seconds will have passed, whereas the people on the outside could have experienced years. And I believe that this light has to do with the light of God, and that is why he is timeless, because he is the speed of light. Now, this is my theory, but again, this is one of those things. It doesn't really matter if you believe it or not. There's no reason to attack somebody or be mean or cruel or get divisive. That's of the enemy. Okay, unless it goes against Christ. Okay, that's when you run into issues. Like, things that are antichrist obviously are bad, and people shouldn't be teaching those things. But to postulate that God is light, and when Adam and Eve fell out of the garden, we fell into a time prison. We basically fell into a trap of the illusion of time because we are not connected to the light of God. And I had postulated once as well that the reason why no man has seen the face of God is because when you see the face of God, you're seeing the infinite light of God. And that would aid you to your death almost instantaneously because you're in the time prison. I don't know if that makes sense, but these are things that I have thought about in the past. And so basically what we have is this cube. We're locked in this cube. We're locked in a dimension of everything is a hexagon. What is a hexagon? A hexagon is a 3D cube. And the 3D cube is the carbon. We are locked in the black carbon. And I believe that the black carbon is the stain on our genetic makeup. It is the serpent. It is the fall of man into this dimension. Now, rewinding a bit, I also believe that the garden was full of trees. And the Bible talks about the garden was full of trees, and that all these trees, I believe, covered the entire earth. These trees were massive, and I believe they were the conduits to heaven, as well as other worlds, possibly, where Adam and Eve could have different dimensions of reality, living in different phase shifts, living in the same reality, but different realities simultaneously. Now, a lot of this is talked about in science fiction, but never in this context, never in the context of the original makeup of our reality before we fell. And I believe these trees were portals, and man could go up and down and converse with God and heaven, and then be in earth as well. And basically, when they were kicked out of the garden, they were basically kicked out of that dimension of perfection. They were still in the same place, but they weren't. In other words, they were phase shifted out of perfection. So the trees were still there, except you couldn't see, they couldn't get back to heaven through them. And these trees then condensed into hexagonal columns because they were now phase shifted into the serpent realm, the fallen realm, right? And it was now not possible to get to heaven. And I believe that all of these trees are now around the earth that were cut down. The book of Enoch talks about angels cutting down trees. And you can see these trees all around the earth. They're like tree stumps. And they're called column basalt. Now, scientists will tell you that column basalt is not a tree stump at all, that it's came from lava flow and things like this. But if you look at these column basalt features, if you just go in and type in column basalt and look at images, Google Images, you'll begin to understand this was not created by lava. This is not molten rock that created these perfect hexagonal honeycomb matrices of these different, they look like stems almost. Many of them even have cores to them. Very overt similarities to what would a tree stump would look like. So why does all that matter? Well, it matters because it's the rest of the history of the world. And if you don't know these things, it's really easy for the devil to play tricks with your mind. Like the subscriber that came on and was, I think she had probably good intentions, but she was just feeling very disheartened. Like there was no proof that God exists. The proof is all around you. And the proof that he loves you is all around you. And the fact that he gave his son and there's a Bible that survived down to this day with the salvation plan tells you everything you need to know. You simply have to believe and live out your life and try to be good to others and believe in him and teach others about his love. That's pretty much what we're here to do. And it gets hard sometimes because we're prosecuted and all these things. But you guys, even though we have our stuff we have to deal with here, it's nothing compared to what people had to suffer in the past. Okay. There was real suffering back then. No food to eat. Here in America, everybody has food to eat. There's always a way to eat food. There's always a place to live. Even if you have to ask for it or take handout, America is a place where we have abundance. And sometimes we forget that. And we want to say, woe is me. But there is real suffering in this world. And I know the children are suffering from abuse, and that's what we try. That's why we spend so much time on this channel trying to expose that stuff. And hopefully we're making an impact because that's really bad suffering as well. But oftentimes as adults, we choose our own suffering through the lies of the devil. The devil lies to us. We patch our lives with things, and then we suffer through our own choices and demise. So these trees dotted the entire earth. They were cut down by the angels. It's interesting. I know that the Noah film that came out like 4 or 5 years ago had a lot of disinformation in it. But also the enemy likes to disclose certain things underhandedly that, that they want to disclose. And I believe that the barren landscape in the film Noah was real, that there were no trees in the barren landscape. And that's because the angels had cut down all the trees. Now, they don't say that. They just show you a barren landscape. But the inference is there are no trees, and there's a reason for it. It's a big white elephant in the room that's not ever brought up or discussed in the movie. And it's almost like they're laughing at us because generally in Christianity, the book of Enoch is not accepted. But the book of Enoch talks about the barren landscape and how it was after the fall of man, and how the fallen angels and Nephilim consumed all the acquisitions of men, cut down all of the trees. And basically, and then after everything was used up, then they began to eat men. They were the first cannibals. So now you understand what all that really means. So we were living in an altered carbon reality, okay? Which was different than the original likeness of man and the world in reality. It was an altered reality, a fallen reality. Everything fell into a cube matrix format. This is why molecules, many of them have this hexagonal makeup. That's because it's the ether, and it's how things assemble. They self-organize into these shapes in this fallen realm. This is why snowflakes all fall into a hexagonal pattern. Every single snowflake is different, but they all have the same exact hexagonal pattern, which to me is amazing. We also have honeycombs. Bees have a honeycomb which is made up of the same hexagon. And of course, all molecular matter, for the most part, has this hexagonal matrix. That's the cube prison. That's what it is. That's why there's a cube at the North Pole of Saturn. It's a storm that's looks like a cube. And now why is that? We can speculate all day about why that shape is the one that represents our prison. But my guess is that it is the most economic shape. It is the strongest shape with the most space inside of it. So, a triangle is a little bit stronger shape than a hexagon, but a hexagon, even though it's slightly more complex than a triangle, it holds more space. Think of it as like a cage. The minimum amount of sides that you could have for a shape, and then that would be but then also having the most space inside of it. That would be a hexagon, and that's why that is the shape that everything self-organizes into, or most of matter. Now, there's a way out of the cube, and that's the New Jerusalem because it's shaped like a cube too, except it is the cube to correct the cube. So think of the black cube as our time prison, and the new cube as the New Jerusalem, which is mentioned in Revelation. 12,000 furlongs by 12,000 furlongs by 12,000 furlongs. And that would be a cube. Also, the Holy of Holies, the place inside the temple of God, was a cube as well. It's good to understand these things because everything that I'm talking about, you guys are going to hear as an attack on God. You're gonna have people out there, naysayers, bringing these things up in a negative light, same way that they tried to uh, use the body code against God, when in fact it reaffirms and reassures that God exists, that He built the truths inside of your flesh. And it's no different than when we talk about this reality and cubes and things, because the enemy will try to say, "Oh, look, it's a cube, just like the devil's cube. So that means God is evil." No, the way it works is everything that God does that is good, the enemy has a black counterfeit. That's how it works. That's the best way to deceive someone. It's kind of like when we came on YouTube and we were making all these discoveries, and then you saw all these channels pop up that kind of started mimicking channels like this. Now, there were other channels before mine that decoded films and things, but there weren't a lot of channels going into the deeper meanings of the Bible and thinking outside the box, no pun intended. Well, that's what the enemy does. They'll counterfeit discoveries and disclosures and then twist it in their way to take you away from God. And that's why channels like this are so important, because we steer you back to God with the same things that they're trying to discredit God with. We're showing you the lie. Um, let's see, probably about I guess it was 3 years ago. I guess what was it, Zeitgeist, or some of these films came out, got millions and millions of views, basically trying to discredit the Bible by saying that the story of Christ was repeated over and over and over again in other more ancient stories before Christ walked the earth. Okay. Now, if you're a new Christian, or if you're someone on the fence, or someone who maybe believes in God but doesn't practice it, doesn't chooses not to attend a church, or whatever the case may be, this could put your salvation in jeopardy to believe that. Why? Because it's not true. Let me tell you why. No one can predate Genesis. I mean, people try, but there's no historical record that goes beyond 6,000 years. I mean, in terms of man-made things, they might try to say, dinosaurs lived millions and millions of years ago, but in terms of man, modern man, there is no record, no archaeological record before the book of Genesis of modern man. Now, people are going to try to, evolved man. People will try to say, oh, well, there was evolved man. Okay, well, that doesn't count. We're talking about modern man. Okay. And I don't believe in evolution either. There's no record before that. So let's go back to the book of Genesis. And when you look at the book of Genesis, you see that all the way back then, before the pyramids were built, before Buddha, before Hindu, before all these stories that they say duplicate Christ's story, Before all that, God was already talking about a savior to come. He was already talking about two seed lines. One seed line was the seed line of Christ. And this is why it's important not to just rely on your standard Christian experience. You have to think outside the box because nowhere do they explain this in church and Christianity. They don't explain to you the two seed lines, and it's central. It's a central theme in the Bible, and you have to address it because if you don't address it, then you don't understand that God was already talking about his Savior to come in the Garden of Eden, that there would be these two seed lines that would battle throughout the ages, enmity between the seeds, the two seeds. And from that point, the bloodline split off. Cain's bloodline split off from Adam's. Cain is not included in Adam's lineage in the Bible. And you can say what you want, but again, there's people out there using this as disinformation. They're twisting it to their own desires and needs. And we're not saying what they're saying. Okay, so be clear on that. I don't want this channel to ever be associated with like Jonathan Kleck or channels like that because they've twisted it in a way that I believe is hurtful, thinking of us as gods and somehow we have some kind of salvation within ourselves. We don't. It all goes back to Christ. It's the whole reason for the seed lines. That's why, because the seed line basically had to be protected throughout all time. This is why there was Israelite armies. This is why they were commanded to wage war. They were fighting the Nephilim armies. Now, we did a lot of early work on these Nephilim armies and what was going on out in the wilderness, the 12 tribes of Israel, the Exodus, and what all that really meant. And we actually looked at the actual lineage, the bloodlines, and tracked them all back to like Cain and even through the flood. And after they got off the boat, they all got tracked back to Ham. So all of these Canaanite armies were of a different bloodline. They were fighting God's bloodline. It was almost like a Terminator film, the Terminator franchise, which a lot of you are familiar with, where the devil is sending these Terminators back in time to try to kill off the bloodline of Christ before Christ could be born, because the enemy already knew Christ was coming. He knew Christ was going to be born because God said it. There was prophecies. Even the flood was a prophecy pointing to Jesus. And nothing predates, well, very few things predate the flood. But Buddha didn't predate the flood. Hinduism didn't predate the flood. And none of these other stories that we're told are just like the Christ story predate the flood. So how does the flood predict that Jesus would be here? Well, let me explain it to you. 40 days and 40 nights. That was the 40 days in the wilderness that Jesus was in. The baptism was the boat. The boat are like ribs of the human body. When the ark went and was submerged in the waters for 40 days and nights, that was like Jesus being baptized in the Jordan River. His ribs submerged in the water, full of all of the life of humanity, just like the ark was full of the seed of humanity. All of the life would rest on Christ's sacrifice. And the dove that Noah released did not return. It didn't return until thousands of years later when Christ was baptized. That dove returned. Wasn't the same dove, but symbolically, it was the same dove. So you see, even the flood was pointing forward to Christ. Noah knew it. He knew there would be a savior. Noah was of the bloodline of Christ. The Israelites were of the bloodline. He was the lion of the tribe of Judah. And even the carcass of the lion full of bees in Samson, that was all about Jesus. He was the lion full of the bees. He had to carry the hexagons of sin within him, but he made honey out of it. He made something wonderful. out of the sin. This was a sacrifice. See, none of this is explained in church. This is why I don't attend church. But many people have to attend church in their early stages of Christianity. But then your walk continues, and many of you grow out of the church because you realize the church isn't feeding you anything else that you need to be fed. In fact, a lot of churches can work against you because it's a power structure. And so what they do is they have power. Those at the top get away with whatever they want, just like in this world we live in. Just like how none of these criminals go to jail, these millionaires. It's the same thing in the church. And I've seen it firsthand in my own personal experience in the church. And that sends the wrong message. And they'll be dealt with by God. That's why I don't worry about it. But basically, we were locked in this time prison. And Christ is the key. He's the only way out. All right. And you just have to believe it was already done. Everything's already been taken care of. So I think that's about it, you guys. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Now I can see the chat here. Let me run through some of these, some of the chat here and see if there's anything we can continue to talk about before I get off here. I see Rickroll Facts in the mod. See, thanks. All right. Now, not attending church isn't give us carte blanche permission just to do what thou wilt. That's not the point of it. The point is to understand that works isn't what's going to save you. You know, regularly attending a church, showing up, giving your tithe, they have you on a schedule. If you don't show up to church, they try to make it about, oh, we miss you, but it's about church attendance. And they judge you on how good of a Christian you are based on how involved you are in the church. And that's not how God works. The people around you are your mission field. The people in your life become your mission field. And so we can never, I would see so many people going off on mission trips to help people when they couldn't even treat the people around them with love and respect, or they couldn't even help their own communities or their own families. And so we're already given our mission field. It's our family. It's our everything around us. People in our community. It could be your neighbor. It's not to say that all churches are bad, but many of them are sucking from the breast of mammon, money, the 501c3. And so what's happened is they've sold out. They basically go along with the 501c3 agenda versus God's agenda, which basically says you're not allowed to talk about certain things in church. And if you do, you can have your tax exempt status revoked. The threat is always there. There are very clear rules. A lot of people don't understand this. There are very, very clear rules about what you can and can't talk about in church if you are taking the 501c3 tax exemption, and it's not in line with what God says and what God says they should be teaching. So now smaller churches that don't receive the tax exempt status, that might be different. Okay. All right. What else do we have? Yes, Dwayne, 501c3 was intentionally to cause greed, and that's exactly what it did. It's all about how many, what is it called? Church members you have. This is why they are so careful about making sure that you have a church membership, that you're a member. And if you leave that church, you're transferred to another church. Because it's all accounting. They have to account for everything, you guys. All this stuff is reported to the IRS. And I remember when I was leaving that one church and they were like, well, where are you going to go? Are you going to attend the church in the other area? I'm like, whoa, what is that? That's kind of weird. Like, why does that really matter to you? And then they would send the information to the new church and then you'd get transferred over. It got really weird. It's all accounting and money. And that's not part of God. Jesus threw the money tables out of the church. Not supposed to be Money is not supposed to be central to your experience with the Lord. Okay. So if you're not sure about 501c3, look it up for yourself. Look at the rules, look at the reporting requirements. You can see for yourself that it's just wrong. But yet all these corporate churches are tax exempt. Now, this is a recent phenomenon. This came up in like the 70s under like Johnson. He passed the 501c3 tax exemption. And I think he did that to take control of the churches. Churches are not allowed to get involved in politics. They're not allowed to get out the vote. You're not allowed to like round up all the people in your church and tell them to vote one way. They can infer how you should vote, but they can't give sermons saying, everybody vote for Trump or everybody vote for Obama. They're not allowed to do that. And the reason why they're not allowed to do that is because if they did, government knows that they would be overrun by Christians and believers, and that the Christians and believers would put forth a candidate, and that candidate would win because there would be a majority vote, because there's a lot more Christians than there are everyone else if everybody got on the same page. In other words, they understood the power of God and the power of seeing someone who is a good leader, and they couldn't allow that. So they don't allow churches to rally around and push politics and voting. They don't allow it. If you don't believe me, look it up for yourself. So, yeah, 501c3 corporation, exactly, artificial man. All right. They don't allow to talk against Jews, says Susan. Exactly. That's another big lie, is that Zionism pretty much across the board in the Christian experience in America is behind Israel, because we've been lied to about the true Israel and the prophecies and all this stuff. So Israel gets away with pretty much whatever they want. All right. Somebody could please explain black goo. Is it part of the black cube? That's a great question, Noreen. So Noreen asks, can someone explain black goo? Is it part of the black cube? I have to say, one of my friends, we don't talk a lot, but Nicholson 1968, there's a lot of Nicholson 1968. Let me clearly say that in case any of you want to check out his channel. There's a lot of work on programmable matter and black goo. He's got a lot of theories on that, which are really good to hear. My theory is a little bit different than his, but similar. And that is that all of the life is in this DNA. Okay. This is the program. This is the genetic makeup, the blueprint for life. And what they're trying to do is recreate life. They're trying to figure out how to use these building blocks to reanimate life. This is what the elite are trying to do. And they can do it with cloning. But what they'd like to do is actually use these building blocks without a clone and actually try to create something from nothing, from the ether. And so I believe what happened was that these Egyptian pharaohs were actually Nephilim. If you look at a lot of the Egyptian iconography and hieroglyphics, you'll see that the Egyptian pharaohs were depicted as giants compared to the rest of the people. They were twice and three times the size of the rest of the people. And a lot of people say, "Oh, that's just because that's just because they were more important. They were made more prominent in the art and hieroglyphics." No, I believe they were actually literally twice the size. And so what happened is, when these pharaohs died, possibly because they knew part of what was to come in the future and they knew the future timeline, we know that the demons knew that it was not their time to die. When Jesus cast them into the 2,000 pigs, they said it is not yet time. So Jesus couldn't kill them. And so they have a general timeline. Even though they don't know the day or the hour, they know when the end of days is. And that's why all this technology has been ramped up in these last 20 years exponentially. That's because they're letting loose all of everything to make a last fight and stand for the hearts and minds of man. And man seems to be losing. You see, morals have basically broke down. There are no more morals left. It's pretty much do whatever you want and no one can judge you for it. So these ancient pharaohs knew about the timeline. They were the fallen ones that ruled after the flood. Mizraim was the first, and he was the son of Ham. He was like the first pharaoh. It's the first time the word Egypt is mentioned in the Bible. It is the name Mizraim. Mizraim means Egypt. Again, Mizraim was the son of Ham after they got off the boat. And he was the first pharaoh. And my guess is that he was part Nephilim or had knowledge of the bloodlines, let's say. So this all happened, and these pharaohs, after they died, needed to preserve their DNA. So how do you preserve the DNA? Well, I believe that they took their organs, which would encode the DNA, and they put them in these canopic jars. Canopic jar looks like a vase, looks like a flower vase. It's fat in the middle and skinny on both ends. Looks like a cigar. And they sealed these these organs with the DNA inside these canopic jars, which then over time biodegraded into black goo. So when they were opening these canopic jars, they found this black goo inside, which is the condensed DNA of these Nephilim giants. So now what they're trying to do is they're trying to reanimate this. They're trying to take this black goo and create another giant. And this could be what the keys to the abyss are. The keys to reanimating life will be given to them. And part of CERN's experiments, I believe, are time travel, but they also have a dual purpose as to looking at the building blocks of the universe so that they can reanimate flesh and bring these beings back into our dimension, so to speak. So yes, decomposed DNA, exactly, Rolo. And so they got this DNA. It's this black goo, and I think what they did too is they opened these jars, and they saw some kind of supernatural event where this goo actually moves and has properties, visual properties about it that are out of this world, which suggests fallen angel blood. I think Nicholson 1968 does some work on that too, how this black goo like moves by itself and stuff. It's weird how this stuff works. And so these scientists are fascinated with this because they're like wringing their hands going, wow, we're gonna bring back the fallen ones, right? So this is why there's all this talk about reanimating dinosaurs and all this stuff. It's getting you prepared for the fallen ones. Pretty soon, they're not going to be talking about giants anymore. Dinosaurs anymore. Pretty soon, they're going to be talking about giants or early man, and those will be the fallen ones. And that's where all this is headed. So basically, that's what's going on with the black goo. Now, we saw this on display in the film Alien. It was one of the more recent films. I think it was in Prometheus. And they showed all these canopic jars. And inside was the black goo. And the black goo came out, was moving around by itself. And inside the black goo was the serpent, the alien, right? These people are aliens. They're not people, they're actually fallen ones. And they infected mankind, which is exactly what happened. They went in through the eyes. Eve could see. Remember, after she partook of the fruit, she could see. And in the Prometheus film, the black goo enters through the eyes when the man is seeing. That's how he's infected. And then it's a blood thing because everyone who's touched or bitten is infected, and so all of us are infected. That's why Christ says we are all born into sin. And the womb is actually called the matrix. Matrix being another word for a hexagon or a lattice work of control, a prison. So you see how it all fits together when you really think about this stuff. All right, so everybody please thumbs up this live show. Hopefully this helps clarify my viewpoint on some things. And see what else is going on in the chat. Satan's blood, exactly, Lisa. Black goo was in the X-Files. Yes, it was, Michael. Gate for stars to enter death. Yeah, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to basically bring something through or go somewhere. Trapped in the sine wave, Grumpy Troll says. Yes, exactly. Sine wave looks like a serpent. And it's basically, how do we put this? There's two different kinds of waves. Well, we won't get into that on this show, but there's something to wavelengths. Okay. Spiral is actually a wavelength. It's a three-dimensional form of a wavelength of the prison of the sine wave. And that's where we're all stuck into, spiraling away from Jesus. Exactly. Falling. When something falls, it falls in a spiral as well. It doesn't fall straight down. It falls in a spiral. OA decode. Yeah, we decoded the OA. The second season was so lame, and then there were like themes of sexual fluidity, which I just can't decode stuff like that, you guys, because they're programming everyone to accept all this stuff. So that's where I draw the line. So what does all this stuff do? This stuff helps you understand this reality better. The devil lies to us and has hidden everything from us. And so the elite know about a lot of this stuff, but they're never going to share it with us because then they're exposed, right? Then we understand what's really going on. They hate anything that's going to build your faith. That's why they give you a basic form of religion. You get a basic form that basically a third grader can understand. But then once you grow out of it, they hope that you grow out of God. That's what they're hoping that you do instead of growing deeper in God. That's why they don't promote digging deeper and thinking deeper about things in the Bible. It's why no one ever, talked to you in Bible school about the number 40. And now the number 40 is repeated over and over again in the Bible. That it goes from the flood to the 40 years of the Israelites in the wilderness to Jesus being in the wilderness for 40 days and nights. All of that means something. That's the womb. When you're born into the womb, the 40 weeks that the child is in the womb, we are born into the matrix. We're born into the wilderness. All this means something, but they don't tell you any of this because they give you a basic form and a basic understanding so that you'll grow out of it and then you'll just give up on God altogether. You'll throw the baby out with the bathwater, which no pun intended there either. Because think about it. When Christ's side was pierced, blood and water came out. That's exactly what happens when you're born. First comes the water, then comes the blood. You see how all this fits together? There's so much deeper meanings to the Bible. It's faith building because it's real. It makes it real. Otherwise, they're just stories. If you don't apply it to your life now and this reality now, they're just stories. But when you begin to think about these things and what it really meant when Christ's side was pierced, and that also points back to Eve being taken out of Adam's side, which was a reverse birth, if you think about it, because all man was born of woman, right? Except for Adam. Adam wasn't born of woman. He was born of God. But he gave birth to Eve from his side through God. You see how fascinating that is? So this is why we need to keep our minds open. And always, if something goes against Christ, then it's not true and it's not real. That's the litmus test, you guys. People are trying to talk you out of things or trying to tell you that the God of the Old Testament was really the devil. Those are channels you don't want to follow anymore, because eventually that's going to lead you to not believing in Christ, because that very God that protected the Israelites in the wilderness, that was the bloodline of Christ to come. How could that be the devil? He would have destroyed that seed of the Israelites. He would have destroyed the tribe of Judah from which Jesus would come. So don't believe some of these channels that are trying to trick you. Okay. So, all right, guys, that's a lot of information. Many of your minds are probably blown right now. Give this video a chance to kind of seek in. We'll do other live shows like this. I kind of like speaking off the cuff because I don't do it a lot because um I just want to make sure the information gets across to you guys. So oftentimes I'll write out my thoughts before I do a video. But this was all off the cuff today, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Much love to everybody. Remember, be the change that you want to see in the world. If your life sucks and you think, wow, if everybody was like my life, the world would suck, then you've got work to do. Take care and be safe, everybody.